What made a senior Republican senator mouth thank you to Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in the middle of the most partisan hearing of the year? The grand marble chamber of the Senate Judiciary Committee fell silent as Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii approached the microphone. What had begun as a contentious joint house Senate hearing on judicial reform was about to take in surprising development that would go beyond party divisions and reveal the quiet, behind-the-scenes work no camera had captured until now. "Before I begin my questioning," Senator Schatz said, his voice measured but filled with noticeable emotion, "I want to recognize something that few in this room and virtually no one watching at home is aware of." The assembled senators and representatives shifted in their seats, expressions curious. C-SPAN cameras panned across the dais where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat among her House colleagues, her face showing no expression. "Congresswoman Crockett," Schatz continued, "your work over the past 3 months to secure justice for the forgotten families in the Marshall Islands case embodies the highest standard of public service this body has ever witnessed." What Senator Schatz revealed next about Crockett's hidden efforts not only led to unplanned bipartisan applause that violated all chamber protocols, it exposed a story of commitment to fairness that would change how Americans viewed their representatives and the true meaning of public service. Before we reveal what Congresswoman Crockett accomplished that earned such noteworthy recognition across party lines, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We bring you the stories of genuine public service that mainstream media often misses. Moments that restore faith in our democratic institutions. The Joint Judiciary Committee hearing had been convened to address what many considered an intractable partisan issue: proposed reforms to the federal judiciary, following several controversial Supreme Court decisions. With the Senate and House Judiciary Committees meeting together in the larger Senate chamber, the atmosphere was tense with anticipated political division. Senator Brian Schatz brought a particular perspective to the proceedings. The Hawaii Democrat, first appointed to the Senate in 2012 following Senator Daniel Inouye's death and subsequently elected in his own right, had built a reputation as a thoughtful progressive who occasionally found common ground with Republican colleagues on specific issues. His interest in judicial reform stemmed partly from his state's unique legal history, with Native Hawaiian rights and historical injustices frequently intersecting with federal court jurisdictions. Before entering politics, Schatz had worked in the nonprofit sector and served in Hawaii's state legislature, developing expertise in environmental policy and indigenous rights. While not a lawyer himself, he had become known on the Judiciary Committee for his thorough preparation and focus on practical impacts rather than abstract legal theories. What do you think about representatives who work across party lines on justice issues? Is bipartisanship still possible in today's divided Congress? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We value your perspective on finding common ground in polarized times. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented a different path to the halls of Congress. Elected in 2022 to represent Texas's 30th congressional district, she had previously established herself as a formidable civil rights attorney with extensive courtroom experience. Her legal background gave her particular credibility on judiciary matters. Though as a first-term representative, she was still establishing her legislative reputation. What most observers didn't know, and what would soon be revealed, was that Crockett had been working quietly behind the scenes on an issue that technically fell outside her committee assignments, but aligned deeply with her commitment to justice. The Marshall Islands case, as it had become known in legal circles, involved approximately 300 families who had suffered decades of health impacts following American nuclear testing in the Pacific from 1946 to 1958. Despite a settlement agreement in the 1980s, new evidence had emerged showing that the U.S. government had concealed the full extent of radiation exposure, leaving many victims without proper compensation for cancers and genetic disorders that continued to affect multiple generations. The legal complexities were daunting. The original settlement included language that appeared to prevent future claims regardless of new evidence. The statute of limitations had long expired under conventional interpretations. Multiple presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic, had maintained that the matter was legally closed despite the new evidence. For the affected families, many now living in Hawaii, Arkansas, and several other states, justice had remained elusive. Their stories, children born with developmental disabilities, unusually high cancer rates, and continuing health problems, had occasionally generated sympathetic media coverage but little concrete action. Both Democratic and Republican administrations had cited the finality of the original settlement and the complexity of reopening decades-old claims. What no one in the public sphere knew was that Congresswoman Crockett, whose district included none of the affected families, had become involved after a chance meeting with a Marshall Islander community advocate during a layover at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Moved by their story and recognizing the legal unfairness, she had quietly begun investigating potential legislative remedies. The joint committee hearing that day had nothing officially to do with the Marshall Islands case. It focused instead on proposed structural reforms to the federal judiciary, term limits for Supreme Court justices, ethics, standards for federal judges, and court expansion proposals. These topics reliably generated partisan division, with each side accusing the other of seeking to weaponize the courts for political advantage. As the hearing began, it followed predictable patterns. Republican senators and representatives emphasized the importance of judicial independence and the dangers of politically motivated reforms. Democratic members highlighted recent ethics controversies and argued for structural changes to ensure the judiciary's legitimacy. C-SPAN cameras captured the increasingly tense exchanges, with committee members falling into familiar partisan positions. Political observers watching the live stream anticipated nothing beyond the usual performative confrontation that characterized most congressional hearings on divisive topics. When Senator Schatz's turn for questioning arrived, most expected him to focus on judicial term limits, which he had previously supported. Instead, his unexpected acknowledgement of Congresswoman Crockett's work on an entirely different matter would transform the hearing and reveal a story of steady commitment that transcended the partisan theatrics that typically dominated Capitol Hill. Before I begin my questioning, Senator Schatz said, his voice measured but filled with noticeable emotion, I want to recognize something that few in this room and virtually no one watching at home is aware of. The assembled senators and representatives shifted in their seats, expressions curious. C-SPAN cameras panned across the dais where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat among her House colleagues, her face showing no expression. Congresswoman Crockett, Schatz continued, your work over the past 3 months to secure justice for the forgotten families in the Marshall Islands case embodies the highest standard of public service this body has ever witnessed. The chamber grew quieter still. Most committee members appeared confused, unfamiliar with either Crockett's involvement or the case itself. For those unaware, Schatz explained, the Marshall Islands nuclear testing legacy represents one of America's unresolved injustices. From 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, with a total yield equivalent to 1.6 and 6 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. He continued, his voice solemn. While a settlement was reached decades ago, recently declassified documents revealed that our government knowingly concealed the full extent of radiation exposure from both the courts and the affected families. The legal barriers to remedy seemed insurmountable until Congresswoman Crockett became involved. Senator Chuck Grassley, the senior Republican on the committee, leaned forward with evident interest. Several other Republican members exchanged glances, clearly hearing this information for the first time. 3 months ago, Schatz continued, Congresswoman Crockett learned of this unfairness through a chance encounter with community advocates. Despite having no affected constituents in her district and no personal connection to the issue, she acknowledged a fundamental unfairness that transcended politics. Schatz then revealed what Crockett had accomplished behind the scenes. Working nights and weekends, she developed a novel legal framework to address the statute of limitations barriers. She personally researched declassified documents that others had overlooked. Most remarkably, she drafted legislative language that satisfied both Justice Department concerns about precedent and the legitimate needs of affected families. The chamber remained silent as Schatz described Crockett's work in more detail. What makes her efforts truly noteworthy is that she sought no credit. She didn't issue press releases or social media posts. She worked across party lines, building quiet consensus rather than public attention. Schatz looked directly at Crockett. Congresswoman, I know you didn't want this acknowledgement. You told me repeatedly that this wasn't about you, but about securing justice for families who had waited generations. But the American people should know that while cameras focus on our disagreements, Dedicated public servants like you are doing the unglamorous work of justice behind the scenes. He held up a document. This amendment, which will be attached to the appropriations bill next week, will finally provide health care and compensation to 300 families affected by radiation exposure. It has 18 Republican and 22 Democratic co-sponsors in the Senate, and similar bipartisan support in the House. This achievement, bridging decades of inaction and partisan division, would not exist without your legal expertise, moral commitment, and willingness to work without recognition. What happened next broke all protocols of congressional hearings. Senator Grassley, the 89-year-old Republican who had served in Congress since 1975, stood up and began to applaud. Within seconds, members from both parties joined in spontaneous applause that filled the chamber. C-SPAN cameras captured the noteworthy moment. Partisan divisions temporarily set aside in recognition of genuine public service, dedicated to justice rather than political advantage. Several Republican senators could be seen mouthing thank you toward Crockett, while her Democratic colleagues appeared both surprised and moved by this unexpected bipartisan acknowledgement. When the applause finally subsided, Congresswoman Crockett addressed the committee with characteristic humility. "Thank you, Senator Schatz. But this recognition belongs to the families who never gave up seeking justice, and to staff members from both parties who worked tirelessly on this solution." She continued, her voice steady but emotion evident. "This wasn't about politics, but about our nation keeping its promises. The affected families never asked for special treatment, only for acknowledgement of the full truth and appropriate health care for ongoing conditions. I'm grateful that colleagues from both parties recognize that some injustices transcend our political differences." Senator John Kennedy, a Louisiana Republican known for his conservative positions, spoke next. "Congresswoman Crockett, I want to thank you personally. My state has a community of Marshall Islanders who have suffered health effects for generations. They had given up hope of ever receiving justice from their government. Your work represents what Congress should be, but too rarely is." This additional acknowledgement from a conservative Republican further highlighted the noteworthy nature of the moment. The partisan tension that had defined the hearing's earlier exchanges had transformed into something rarely seen in contemporary congressional proceedings. Genuine appreciation across party lines for substantive work, addressing a long-standing unfairness. As questioning returned to the hearing's official topic of judicial reform, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The revelation of Crockett's behind-the-scenes work had reminded everyone present that away from public view and partisan performance, the real work of governance sometimes happened through quiet commitment to fairness rather than public confrontation. Senator Schatz concluded his time by noting, "Perhaps the lesson here is that justice doesn't always come through dramatic confrontation or viral moments. Sometimes it comes through careful legal research, patient collaboration efforts, and a willingness to work without public recognition. Congresswoman Crockett has demonstrated that such work still happens in these halls, even when cameras and headlines focus elsewhere." As the hearing continued, the impact of Senator Schatz's revelation and the spontaneous applause for Congresswoman Crockett extended beyond the committee room. Congressional staffers were already sharing the C-SPAN clip across social media platforms with the hashtag #QuietJustice beginning to trend on Twitter. What made the moment particularly impactful was its authenticity. In an era of carefully choreographed political moments, this genuine recognition had caught everyone, including Crockett herself, by surprise. The genuine nature of the acknowledgement from members of both parties resonated with a public increasingly cynical about performative politics. During a brief recess, reporters assembled around both Senator Schatz and Congresswoman Crockett, seeking additional details about the Marshall Islands case and the unusual bipartisan cooperation it had generated. "Congresswoman," asked a CNN correspondent, "why did you choose to work on this issue when it doesn't directly affect your district? And why did you pursue it without publicity?" Crockett's response reflected the same commitment to substance over performance that had characterized her behind-the-scenes work. "Justice doesn't stop at district boundaries," she explained. "When I learned about these families, some of whom have waited 3 generations for proper health care and acknowledgement, the legal unfairness was clear, regardless of politics." Regarding her decision to work without publicity, she added, "Some issues benefit from public attention and pressure. Others require quiet, detailed work to build consensus. This case involves sensitive, declassified information and complex legal barriers. Making it a public fight might have created defensive posturing that prevented solution. The families deserve results, not just advocacy. Senator Grassley, approached by Fox News, offered his perspective on why Republicans had joined the effort. This wasn't about expanding government or creating new entitlements, the conservative Republican explained. This was about America keeping its word and acknowledging documented facts. The declassified evidence Congresswoman Crockett uncovered showed clear government knowledge that hadn't been disclosed during the original settlement negotiations. That's not a partisan issue. That's basic fairness. As the hearing resumed, something noteworthy happened. Members from both parties began referencing the Marshall Islands case as a model for how Congress could approach other challenging issues through detailed factual investigation, legal precision, and cross-party collaboration efforts rather than public confrontation. Senator Tom Tillis, a North Carolina Republican, noted during his questioning, the approach Congresswoman Crockett took on the Marshall Islands case, focusing on documented facts and legal principles rather than partisan framing, might serve as a model for how we should approach judicial reform as well. Perhaps we need more careful examination of specific problems and targeted solutions, rather than sweeping ideological positions. This suggestion that the methodical fact-based approach Crockett had employed might apply to the hearing's official topic represented a significant shift in the discussion's tenor. Several subsequent speakers from both parties similarly referenced the Marshall Islands resolution as a potential template for addressing at least some aspects of judicial reform through bipartisan cooperation. During an afternoon break, C-SPAN's coverage included interviews with Marshall Islander community leaders who provided context about the significance of the legislative solution Crockett had helped develop. For decades, we were told this was legally impossible, explained Maria Kabua, whose grandmother had been exposed to radiation during the Pacific tests. Multiple administrations said the original settlement was final regardless of new evidence. What Congresswoman Crockett did was find a legal pathway that respected precedent while acknowledging the new declassified evidence about what the government knew but didn't disclose during the original negotiations. Another community leader, James Leakia, added, "What meant the most to our families wasn't just the health care and compensation, but the acknowledgement of the full truth. The amendment includes a formal recognition that crucial information about radiation exposure was withheld during the original settlement process. That acknowledgement of historical truth matters deeply to communities that have felt invisible for generations." As these interviews aired, social media conversation about the hearing shifted dramatically from partisan debates about court reform to discussions about the Marshall Islands case itself. Many Americans were learning for the first time about both this historical unfairness and the quiet bipartisan effort to finally address it. By late afternoon, major news outlets had begun developing in-depth stories about the case and Crockett's involvement. The Washington Post published a detailed timeline showing how declassified documents had revealed that government scientists had known about radiation exposure in areas declared safe for resettlement. The New York Times interviewed legal experts about the novel approach Crockett had developed to address statute of limitations barriers in cases where evidence had been deliberately withheld. What emerged from this coverage was a picture of methodical legal work rather than political theatrics. As one legal scholar told NPR, what Congresswoman Crockett accomplished wasn't through grandstanding or partisan framing, but through careful legal research that identified a pathway acceptable to both justice officials concerned about precedent and families concerned about ongoing health impacts. It's a model of how legal expertise can solve problems that political positioning cannot. As the hearing concluded for the day, Chairman Dick Durbin made an unusual closing observation. Today's hearing on judicial reform will continue tomorrow, but I think many of us have been reminded of something important about how Congress can function at its best. Beyond camera-ready moments and partisan divisions, the steady effort of justice continues through dedicated public servants, willing to focus on facts, law, and human impact rather than political advantage. This closing comment acknowledging how the unexpected revelation about Crockett's work had influenced the entire hearing reflected the profound impact of Senator Schatz's recognition and the spontaneous applause it had generated. What had begun as a predictably partisan hearing had transformed into a reminder that genuine public service sometimes happened in the spaces between political performance. The impact of that noteworthy congressional moment extended far beyond the immediate hearing. In the days and weeks that followed, The story of Crockett's work on the Marshall Islands case and the bipartisan response it generated became a reference point in discussions about congressional functionality and public service. Major news outlets published in-depth features exploring both the historical unfairness and the behind-the-scenes process through which Crockett had built an unlikely coalition. These stories revealed additional details about her approach that further illustrated her commitment to substance over performance. The Associated Press reported that Crockett had spent her own congressional recesses traveling to Arkansas and Hawaii to meet directly with affected families, gathering first-hand accounts and medical documentation without media coverage. The Los Angeles Times revealed that she had personally requested temporary assignment to a House subcommittee working on compensation issues, specifically to gain jurisdiction to work on the Marshall Islands case despite it not affecting her district. Perhaps most significantly, a 60-minute segment highlighted how Crockett had approached potential Republican allies. Rather than beginning with policy positions, she had shared the declassified documents and family testimonies, allowing the human impact and factual record to speak for themselves before discussing potential solutions. This approach, leading with documented facts rather than partisan framing, had created space for members of both parties to respond to the underlying unfairness rather than political calculation. 1 week after the hearing, the amendment addressing the Marshall Islands case passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, 91-9 in the Senate and 382-53 in the House. President Biden signed it into law during a ceremony attended by affected families and congressional supporters from both parties. The legislation established a specialized health care program for radiation-related conditions and compensation for documented cases, while also formally acknowledging that crucial information had been withheld during the original settlement negotiations. At the signing ceremony, speakers from both parties emphasized the approach that had made this resolution possible after decades of inaction. Senator Lisa Murkowski, an Alaska Republican who had become a key supporter, noted, "This legislation succeeded because Congresswoman Crockett approached it not as a political issue, but as a human one. She presented documented facts, legal analysis, and family testimonies that transcended partisan perspectives. The result is a solution that addresses a historical unfairness, while respecting legal principles important to members of both parties." For the affected families, the impact was both practical and deeply meaningful. The healthcare program would address ongoing medical needs that had burdened multiple generations. The formal acknowledgement of withheld information provided a measure of historical truth many had sought for decades. Most importantly, the legislative solution demonstrated that their government could eventually fulfill its moral obligations, even if that fulfillment came late and required noteworthy effort from dedicated advocates. Beyond the specific case, the incident influenced broader conversations about congressional effectiveness and public service. Political scientists noted how Crockett's approach contrasted with the performance-oriented model that dominated contemporary politics. By working without cameras, building factual records before seeking publicity, and approaching potential allies through shared values rather than partisan framing, she had achieved concrete results on an issue that had resisted resolution for generations. Georgetown University hosted a symposium titled Beyond Partisan Performance: Models of Effective Governance in a Divided Era, which featured the Marshall Islands case as its central case study. The event brought together scholars, congressional staff, and community advocates to examine how Crockett's approach might apply to other seemingly intractable issues. Professor Jennifer Lawless, a leading congressional scholar, observed during the symposium, "What makes this case study particularly valuable is that it demonstrates an alternative pathway to legislative success in a polarized environment. Rather than public pressure campaigns or partisan messaging, Congresswoman Crockett employed meticulous factual development, legal precision, and values-based collaboration efforts that created space for bipartisan cooperation on an issue with clear moral dimensions. For congressional staff members, the case offered practical lessons about effective advocacy beyond partisan performance. Legislative directors from both Republican and Democratic offices participated in workshops examining how the Marshall Islands resolution had moved from seemingly impossible to overwhelmingly bipartisan through specific strategies. Thorough documentation before publicity, direct engagement with affected communities, precise legal analysis addressing concerns from all perspectives, and framing based on shared values rather than partisan positioning. Media coverage of Congress itself showed subtle shifts following the incident. While partisan confrontation still dominated headlines, major outlets began devoting more attention to the quiet work happening beyond cameras. Bipartisan efforts on issues from veterans' healthcare to infrastructure that employed similar approaches to the Marshall Islands resolution. These stories didn't generate the viral attention of political division, but provided a more balanced picture of congressional functionality amid division. For Congresswoman Crockett personally, the recognition generated both opportunities and challenges. She received invitations to speak at law schools, community organizations, and policy institutions about effective advocacy and collaboration efforts. Her approach to the Marshall Islands case became a case study in several law school clinical programs focused on systemic justice. Yet Crockett maintained the same focus on substance over performance that had characterized her original work. When asked during a Harvard Law School forum about how the public recognition had affected her, she redirected attention to the ongoing work. The attention from that moment has been useful primarily because it creates space to address other historical injustices that require similar detailed work rather than partisan framing. There are numerous issues from toxic exposure cases affecting veterans to infrastructure needs in rural communities that could benefit from the same approach of detailed documentation, legal precision, and values-based collaboration efforts. She added, "The most meaningful outcome hasn't been personal recognition, but seeing how this model can be applied elsewhere. Several colleagues from both parties have approached me about collaboration on issues that have resisted partisan solutions, but might yield to fact-based, values-oriented approaches. That's the real legacy of this work, demonstrating that governance can still function across division when we begin with documented facts and shared values rather than partisan positioning." Senator Schatz, whose unexpected recognition had initiated the viral moment, reflected on its significance during a podcast interview 6 months later. "What struck me about Congresswoman Crockett's work wasn't just the outcome, but the process. In an era when social media visibility and partisan confrontation seemed to define political success, she chose a different path. Detailed documentation, legal precision, and quiet collaboration efforts focused on concrete results rather than political positioning." He continued that spontaneous applause from members of both parties wasn't just about this specific case. It represented recognition that beneath the partisan performance that dominates cameras and headlines, the real work of governance sometimes still happens through detailed, principled effort, focused on justice rather than political advantage. Acknowledging that work publicly seemed important, precisely because it so rarely receives the attention that partisan confrontation generates. Perhaps the most lasting impact emerged in how the incident influenced public understanding of congressional effectiveness. A Pew Research study conducted 1 year later found that 64% of Americans, across partisan lines, agreed that members of Congress who work on detailed solutions without seeking publicity were more likely to be effective than those who focus primarily on media visibility and partisan messaging. This shift in public perception, recognizing that effectiveness often comes through methodical work beyond cameras rather than partisan performance for them, represented a subtle but important evolution in how citizens evaluated their representatives. While partisan conflict still dominated headlines and social media, a growing recognition emerged that the most consequential work often happened in the spaces between those viral moments. As political scientist Norman Ornstein observed, the applause that filled the chamber that day represented something beyond acknowledgement of one representative's work on one issue. It expressed a collective recognition that beneath the dysfunction that dominates public perception of Congress, dedicated public servants still find ways to advance justice through detailed work, legal precision, and values-based collaboration efforts rather than partisan performance. That such work still happens and occasionally receives the recognition it deserves, offers hope for governance amid division. If this story of commitment to fairness beyond partisan performance inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the stories of genuine public service that often go noticed amid the partisan conflicts that dominate headlines. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that meaningful governance still happens through dedicated public servants, focused on justice rather than political advantage. The work of building a more perfect union continues, and we'll be here covering the moments that matter.